Welcome to our daily reflection for this Sunday, March 3rd. And of course, the scripture readings are preparing us for our Lenten journey. And of course, the end and goal of our Lenten journey is Holy Week and the passion and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And so as we prepare for that, the church is, showing us that this is where the journey leads with the scriptures today. Now, it may not be apparent to see how the first scripture passage from the book of Exodus, chapter 20, about the Ten Commandments, how that relates to the gospel reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 2, where Jesus is doing a demonstration. He's cleansing the temple. And yet they're very related because, again, in this Lenten season, it's about recalibrating our spiritual life and focusing on God first and foremost. And of course, the very first commandment we get in Exodus 20 is that you shall have no other God beside me. In other words, God is to be in the first place, above all others in our life. And what Jesus does when he is cleansing the temple, he's cleansing the temple, which is his Father's house, and zeal for God's house, as he quotes from Psalm 69, will consume him. In other words, Jesus puts God in the first place. And he's upset and angry that they have taken the house of God, the house of his Father in heaven, the house of God, the temple, and they've turned it into, as he calls it, a den of thieves later on. In other words, they make it into a marketplace. In other words, they're using God and the place that's supposed to be for the worship of God as an occasion for their own personal profit. And so the priests aren't really serving God, they're serving themselves in the way they've turned the outer court into a marketplace. And so Jesus drives out those who buy and sell in the temple court. And he does this out of zeal for God. In other words, they're disordering their love for God, which breaks the first and most important commandment, where you'll have no other God beside me. In other words, God is to be in the first place. And if God is not first in our lives, we are breaking the first commandment. Really, the first commandment is God and God alone is to be worshiped and adored and to be of the first place of our love and of our attention. And so that any putting other things first would be breaking that. And that's what we see happening in the gospel reading, which breaks the first commandment. And so that's that powerful relationship between the first reading and the gospel. And the second reading today from St. Paul to the Corinthians, he talks about how Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified. And of course, that's where this whole story is going. Christ will be crucified in Holy Week. And so we're looking at Christ crucified. And of course, the Jews demand signs and the Greeks seek wisdom in their philosophy. And what we have is, Christ crucified. And notice that Paul will say, but notice that Christ crucified is the power of God and the wisdom of God. And that there's real power and true wisdom in the gospel if we but can see it, right? And that is going to be important. And then just to kind of land back at the gospel here on this Sunday, zeal for your house will consume me. And of course, the disciples see this, what Jesus does, and he says, stop taking my Father's house and making it into a marketplace, as fulfilling Psalm 69. In fact, Psalm 69 ends with this idea that sacrifices of oxen and calves aren't what please God, but a sacrifice of thanksgiving. In other words, thanksgiving and praise is what God seeks. And that's what Jesus wants the temple to be, a place of worship of the Father. And that's what we have to put the Father first, God the Father first in our lives, if we're going to do that. And of course, they ask for a sign, so that's exactly what Paul was talking about. Jews seek signs. And so when Jesus does this, they seek a sign. By what sign do you do these things, right? And Jesus gives them a sign. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. And of course, John then tells us he was speaking about not the physical temple that had been under construction for over 46 years at that time of Jesus, but he's speaking about his own body. And the sign that he has the authority over the house of God will be his resurrection. And that will be the sign. And of course, we will see that sign at Eastertide, right? When we see in Easter, Jesus risen from the dead. And that his body is the true temple, the ultimate temple. And the temple was just a sign, an outward sign and pointer to the true embodiment of God's presence on earth, which is Jesus himself in the incarnation and in his own body. And that temple will be destroyed and yet rebuilt in 3 days. And so we have the whole mystery of Easter and of the Triduum, the Passion of Jesus, all forecast here for us in the readings today. And so notice how they all are intimately connected and prepare us for the Paschal mystery that Lent will take us to. So let's reflect on God. Is he first in my life? That is what Jesus and the scripture readings today are asking us to reflect on in our meditation. Do I put God first and foremost above everything else, right? Or have I made a marketplace of other idols in my time and in my treasures? That's the question for today. May the Lord bless and keep you.
This daily reflection is brought to you thanks to the generous support of the Mission Circle. Join the Mission Circle to help Catholics worldwide understand, live, and share their faith. Sign up at missioncircle.org today.